Hello, everyone. Welcome to another session of the series Contributorcast for Apache TinkerPop. This is where we invite our TinkerPop contributors to come on and talk about the features they've helped to implement, and the challenges or interesting things they've encountered in the process. So we hope this to be a fun and knowledge-sharing series. So today we're going to talk about our most recent release. So I've got our release manager, Ko, here, who's also a recent new committer on Apache TinkerPop. Yeah, so we brought a couple of the committers on, and we're going to chat about some of the new features. So just a quick overview. So today we're going to focus mainly on the 370 features because, that's our a big new major release this time. And then we're going to talk about some of the things that went into 365 as well as 370, and then also some new features I've introduced into the 357 along, with the 365 and 370. So yeah, appreciate everyone's effort over the past, month and working on this. So let's get started. And on the new features in 370. So this is not a comprehensive list of all the things that went in. So we're just picking out some of the features from mainly the upgrade docs. So there's also a more comprehensive list in the changelog. So we're going to start with the properties on element. Pass it over to Valentin.
Historically, vertices and edges worked differently for embedded and remote graph. For example, for local g.v1, you will get element with properties, but for remote graph before 3.7, you will get only ID and label. This created inconvenience for users and made it more difficult to learn. So in 3.7 was added ability to get elements with all properties without using of additional steps like element map or value map. Next slide, please. To control how properties are realized, added new request option named materialize properties. It can be provided for each request to get expected result. If for some reason you don't need properties at all, it can be configured for entire graph by reference element strategy. Also updated all serializers for all GLVs to handle properties.
Sorry, just gonna jump in and ask. So you mentioned this by default now we're having the properties on element returned, whereas in previous versions they won't be. So then, how would that interact in terms of using the old versions GLVs with this new server? What happens in that case?
Result is different for all GLVs and serializers. For rough zone, in most cases, all GLVs are compatible. But for graph binary situation a bit worse. So you cannot use graph binary with old graph binary with modern 3.7 server. In this case, I would like to recommend use reference element strategy to cut all properties at server side.
It's probably worth mentioning here as well that in general, you can usually get away with mixing, let's like say a 3.6 driver with a 3.7 server, that sort of thing, but that's never an officially supported configuration. The only officially supported configs are sticking with the same major version for the server and the client.
Cool, thank you. Yes.
In this version, we added support for mid-traversal E step. In previous versions, you can use E only as start step. In this example, you can see how you can use mid-traversal E to get same result as with merge E. Next slide, please. Oh, I will hand over Jan.
Thank you, Valentin. Yeah, so I think as Valentin said, kind of like so E, the start step E is mid-traversal. Now with union, it's actually previously it's just it's a mid-traversal step that can be only used after a start step. So then the typical workaround it's you inject use inject to inject a dummy value to just start the traversal, and then you can use union. Now, as of now with 370, you no longer need to use the workaround, so you can actually directly call g.union directly. So the workaround has been worked in the background, anyways. So now, so the next one is, I think, also a step update. So actually a new step that we introduced along with a series of string manipulation steps that we plan to just incorporate into the upcoming 3.7 releases. So this is just one of the first. It's our concat function. So what happened is previously actually, if you want to do any string manipulations in Gremlin, you have to use closure. And so with closure, it just, first of all, it doesn't feel like, it just doesn't feel like a Gremlin, it doesn't flow in the Gremlin language. So now with 3.7.0, now we actually introduce this concat step. So as you can see in the example below, so it demonstrates the use of closure in 3.6 to add a new vertex with a label. That's like an existing vertex, but you append a prefix. Now with concat, this operation can now be performed in a more standard Gremlin syntax you just do g.v and then you just use concat. Yeah.
It's also worth mentioning here as well. So the thing with closures and the reason why it's good to have a alternative to them now is that the closures were only part of Gremlin Groovy previously. They weren't supported in Gremlin Lang in the antler-based grammar. So, and many providers didn't support Gremlin Groovy or closures. So if you were using one of those providers that didn't support this, you were just out of luck before. So it's really great to have this natively in Gremlin now.
Yeah, good point, Ko. Yes, so that's also another cool thing about this new set of steps. So just gonna do some more examples since now we're on this. So here's our two examples based on the modern graph you can see on the upper right corner. Basically, the first traversal is we're just filtering out the software vertices and concatenating their names and their language into a string. It says, say, Lop uses Java and Ripple uses Java. And another more complex example is just follow the outgoing edges from Marco's vertex and generate string phrases based on the edge labels and the vertices names, just using chained concat steps. So then we get Marco created Lop, Marco knows Vadas, Marco knows Josh. So a bit more about concat is that it will take in incoming string traversals. It can take a var arg, so a number of string inputs, and then you can take one traversal in. So, but you can always chain concats. So yeah, so we hope people try it out in the 3.7.0. Give us feedbacks. And if you discover bugs, feel free to submit tickets or even PRs, with fixes. Yeah, so that's, and these two examples are actually also available in the reference documentation, so you can play around with them and just check out the reference docs. Yeah, and I think with that, I hand it over to Ken.
Yeah. All right, thanks, Yang. So map and cardinality. So the merge syntax that was introduced in 3.6 with merge E, merge V, they originally added to make it easier to do upsert-like operations. However, this was really only the case if you were doing something with single cardinality, with properties with single cardinality. And that's because the syntax didn't really allow you to specify the cardinality before. So if you look at that 36x example there, you would have to have this workaround where you put in like a side effect to use property step, which did allow for you to specify the cardinality. So we've changed the syntax in 370 to make this easier to work with multi-properties. So as you can see now, option takes in a map that can sort of, so the on match and on create will take in a map where you can specify the cardinality, such as like in the example in the bottom there. And then if we move on to the next slide, there's some more examples here. So these are two other things that were sort of added to make it easier. So in the previous example, you saw that how you could specify the cardinality per property. Here we're showing how this new syntax has also been added so that you can add a default for both the property step as well as the option step. So if we look at the top one, the default cardinality for option, yeah, you can see I bold there at the end, you can use single. So the single cardinality will be used by default, and then it will, it can be overridden by whatever you set inside. Same now goes for the property step, which the example is on the bottom, and that uses the new sort of cardinality value approach. So if we move to the next slide, some more sort of grammar changes. So a little bit about this is that even today, a lot of queries are written with parameters, but this is not something that was supported by Gremlin Lang before. This is only supported in the Gremlin Groovy script engine. And as we're trying to sort of move away and phase out the Gremlin Groovy script engine, it's sort of really important for us to sort of get feature parity between Gremlin Lang script engine and the Gremlin Groovy script engine, which is essentially why we're sort of introducing this sort of ability to use parameters and bindings. So if you look at the example that says 36x, if you try to call the script engine here would be a Gremlin Lang script engine. And if you just tried to do eval on it with some simple bindings, that's what the SB there is, you would just get that exception. However, now in 370, if you try that sort of, the 370 is the more complete example that shows more of the actual code, you would actually be able to get a return result after the script engine.eval. And moving on to the next, so we have Java 17 support. So starting in 370, Apache TinkerPop, we now support Java 17, and it's been incorporated in both our building and testing. So this is something we've actually wanted to do for a while, but we've just been blocked by some dependencies that we couldn't upgrade before. But now that those have been upgraded, we've also made it so that you can run TinkerPop with Java 17. But one thing you should note, however, is that due to the use of deep reflection in mostly the serialization libraries, you may have to do add opens or add exports as some JVM options in order to make it work. This probably won't affect most users. Most of the time, you can probably just use it without having to do this. But if you ever get any sort of errors that say, oh, it does not opens or does not exports, then you'll probably have to do something like an example here. So these examples are just grabbed from our automated build and testing. Those are the ones we added to make everything work. But a lot of those you probably won't have to add.
So just a quick question on that is, so which serializers are probably the most prone to these sorts of issues, and so which user would be the most likely to have to add these opens?
So the one that I think gave me the most trouble when I was trying to do the upgrade was Cryo. So if you're an OLAP user and you use Cryo as your serialization library, or Cryo as the one we do, then you may encounter some of these problems just based on the way it does its serialization. But yeah, so that would be my answer if you use Cryo sort of thing.
All right, thanks. Sounds good.
Okay. Yeah, and I think next up is Tinkergraph transaction, so I'll hand it off to Valentin.
Looks like we have a question related to serialization. So I will answer this now. About graph binary compatibility. Graph binary format doesn't change it. It's same, but implementation for different GLVs has some limitations. Out of my mind, at least Python and Golang implementation doesn't expect properties, so they will not work at all. Some GLVs will just skip properties. So if you import latest version of serializers, then you can use it with older version of Gremlin and solve problem.
Oh, yes, cool. Yes, so concat step was added to 370. There will definitely be more string manipulation functions to follow, such as I guess the to upper, to lower. I think there's trimming operations, and then just the simpler ones as string length functions. So yeah, I think there are definitely more string functions to follow, and along with that, there's actually also there are going to be list manipulation functions and some date time functions to follow. So stay tuned to our dev list post, to our Discord discussions. Yeah, and then if there's any also questions or comments, feel free to drop them into our Discord as well. Yep. I guess. Yeah. Okay. So I guess we'll just continue on, and then we'll also have questions. We might pause for questions in the middle, but we'll also have like a general question period at the very end to address anything we missed. So yeah, I'll hand it back to Valentin.
So about transaction, it's one of biggest features. In previous versions of TinkerPop, only way to use transaction is Neo4j plugin, but that implementation is outdated, is not supported, use really old Neo4j version. So that was one of reasons to implement transaction support in TinkerGraph. Also, it helps users to learn to use for testing TinkerGraph with transaction. This first implementation is quite experimental and is not intended for production use. In example, you can see a simple use case. It's usual transactions without anything special. Isolation level is read committed. Next slide, please. Here you can see some latency numbers. Smaller is better. It's in milliseconds for TinkerGraph, Tinker transaction graph, and Neo4j graph. Some things to note Tinker transaction graph is currently slower for reads than both the Tinker graph and the Neo4j graph. We have an idea how speed up this significantly, and looking to do this in future releases of 3.7. In most write scenarios, Tinker transaction graph performs better than Neo4j graph.
So I just want a quick question. I don't know if you can elaborate, but so you said there's an idea on how to speed up, but is there any guesses to, or rather reason why the read is slower for Tinker graph? Quite a bit slower.
Yes, it's related to too pessimistic locking.
Oh. Yes, that would definitely slow things down. Okay, and then also, like you said, this is a big task, big piece of implementation. What was the most difficult part, out of curiosity, of this?
Most difficult part was to pass stress test made by Ken. It's also a reason for pessimistic locking.
Okay. Yeah, that's often. Okay, all right, and I'll just
Next slide,
next
please.
slide.
A few words about Tinker transaction graph future. So we planning to deprecate Neo4j Gremlin and probably remove in some future releases, but without any timeline. For next months, Tinker graph will be used by default. So Tinker transaction graph can be configured manually if you need transaction. For future releases, we planning performance improvement. We planning to collect feedback, find and fix possible bugs. And for more distant future, probably Tinker transaction graph can be used by default. But for now, we will keep Tinker graph. Next slide, please. And I will start talking about some changes in GLVs. In Gremlin.net was added nullable annotation. For this improvement, we thank Florian. Now Gremlin.net use nullable annotation to state an argument or return value can be null or not. This should make much less likely to get a null reference exception from Gremlin.net. And I would like to hand over to Yang.
Yeah, thank you. So just going to comment on a change in the Gremlin JavaScript for 3.7. So just due to to resolve some potential unhandled rejection and race conditions, that was caused by the connect on startup configuration. To avoid those, we actually have removed this option from the JavaScript driver. So any new driver remote connection objects, they no longer initiate the connection by default as startup. So you have to call open explicitly if you wish to manually connect on startup. And that is the JavaScript update. And then I think we have Cole to run us down on the package changes.
Yeah, thanks, Yang. So the first thing I want to talk about today is, some changes to the packaging in 3.7. So the first one is that all the Java serializers, message classes, and token classes that were formerly in Gremlin driver have been moved to a new module called Gremlin util. And the reason for this is all the classes that are shared by both the server and the driver. So we want to just extract them into their own module so that we no longer need to include the driver as a dependency of Gremlin server. So also with this move, all of those classes have their package names updated. So instead of being Gremlin driver dot ser, I believe they were, and they're now Gremlin util dot ser, that sort of thing. So might need to update a few imports, but other than that, there shouldn't be any problems from this. And then since we already changed those package names, we also took this as an opportunity to rename a lot of the Grafson serializers because their naming convention didn't really align well with the rest of what we had in TinkerPop, and it was just not the most clear naming before. So first, what we've done is we've dropped this D0 suffix at the end of the serializers. So you still always have like this V3, D0, and that sort of thing on the end. Just got rid of that D0. Wasn't being used at all, so it was unnecessary. And we've also just aligned on Grafson message serializer as the base name for all the Grafson serializers. And they've all now have their untyped variant, which is Grafson untyped message serializer. So for example, you have their V3 for both Grafson message serializer and untyped message serializer. Same applies for V1 and V2. So it's just much simpler, much more straightforward on the naming there now. The other piece I want to touch on here is we've moved Simple Socket Server. So what Simple Socket Server is, it's been in the Java driver tests for a long time. It's a little test server it's a Gremlin server-like setup, but not quite the same. And its special idea is that you can hard code specific response behavior from the server. So it's been used in the Java driver previously to do tests such as seeing how the driver will respond to the server closing the connection abruptly, or if there's long delays in the server's response and that sort of stuff. You can really hard code very specific response behavior from the server. This was always exclusive to the Java driver before. Now it's been extracted out into its own module, so it's Gremlin tools / Gremlin socket server, and it's also been Dockerized, and it will run for all of the integration tests for all the GLVs now. So every GLV now has at least a couple of reference tests that run against this thing, and plan to add more as we go along here. But also this is something that will be available for any driver providers out there as well if they're looking for a nice server to test that sort of behavior as well. We'll move on to the next slide. Yeah, so now we're going to switch into features that were added in both 365 and in 370. And the one we want to highlight here is new MIME types in the server. So to start here, we now have a text plain MIME type for the HTTP endpoint, and this will return a kind of console style representation of the data. So you can see that example there. We're doing a curl. It's just a basic g.v with this new text plain MIME type. And this is going against the modern graph, and you'll see the results there that are returned is exactly what you'd expect if you just type g.v into the console. So that's kind of a cool new feature to have. There's also now a serialization option for graph binary over HTTP. There's the MIME type there. I opted to exclude the example on that one because it's completely illegible anyways, but yeah, you can get graph binary now, which is pretty cool. Jump to the next slide here. Yeah. So the other one is there's now new MIME types for all of the untyped Grafson forms. So you can see there in blue is all the MIME types. It's the standard MIME type for that version of Grafson with this types equals false appended to the end of them. And the examples on the right there, the left side is untyped Grafson v3, the right is Grafson v3 with types. So the reason you might want the untyped form here is it's just much cleaner, much simpler. So if you're writing some application where those typing information is not useful to you, so let's say you're writing some JavaScript application that's just hitting a REST endpoint and getting back the results. If you can't do anything with that type information, it just gets in the way, makes it harder to consume the results. So it's in those cases, it might be much nicer just to have this clean JSON come back. I see Arthur from G.V's there in the chat, so maybe this is useful for you if you're using Grafson. I'm not sure, but yeah, it's just a bit of a cleaner representation if you don't need that type of information. So that's all available now. And I wanted to thank all these new MIME types were contributed both by Fininja and Steven together. And Fininja is a relatively new contributor in TinkerPop. I think this is the second or third contribution. So that was really cool to see. Always great to have more people getting involved here. So yeah, thank you so much. That was really great. And I'll pass it off to Ken now to talk about some of the features in 357 and 365 and 370.
Thanks, Cole. Well, you took what I was going to say with the slide. So yeah,
My
this
bad.
section we are going to talk about essentially what Cole just said. Features that will be in all three, which those 357, 365, and 370. So the Gremlin Groovy script engine. So in the last version, 356, we upgraded the Groovy version, and that upgrade unfortunately introduced a bit of a regression to how the Gremlin Groovy script engine's imports work. So it made it so that imports from the __ anonymous traversal class, and so any static methods imported from there, if they had a name clash with something from an enum, then you wouldn't be able to sort of access the one from the anonymous traversal. So if we take a look at the example from 356, if you try to do something like that, values A there, you just have you just get an exception because you wouldn't be able to find the proper method. One thing I will want to say is that the console, the Gremlin console and the Gremlin Groovy script engine actually have two different ways of doing imports. So this only affected the Gremlin Groovy script engine. But yeah, so we've sort of changed how that works now so that it's been fixed. So you can see in 357, you can now do that sort of values with a string parameter, and it'll work again. But so one question you might have is like, oh, where would I normally encounter the Gremlin Groovy script engine then if it doesn't affect the console? Well, the default for the Gremlin server, if you send a script based traversal over, is to sort of use the Gremlin Groovy script engine. And that's why you can see in that 356 example, it was a sort of remote query to a server that returned that error. And another note is that this sort of happens because of the way we've sort of been making notation shorter by allowing you to do the anonymous traversal. However, if you notice that you have a naming clash between something like, say, columns as a values, and then values is also exists in the anonymous traversal class, then moving forward, it's probably better for you to just explicitly state which one you want to use. That way you won't run into this issue. And so this one here is another sort of issue that came up due to the Groovy upgrade, which is that wildcard imports, they don't work anymore for people who use both Java 8 and Windows. So this is actually reported several times on Discord in the questions channel. So so we decided to sort of add another bad file to solve this rather than sort of trying to explain some workarounds that you could use. I just want to make sure, like, users of other operating systems, so if you're on Linux or and if you're not on Java 8, you probably will never be affected by this. And if you are on Windows and use Java 8, the telltale sign that you're getting this problem is that you're going to see something like invalid path exception, and you'll see some references to the Windows path parser in the stack trace. And so if you see that, then you go ahead and use this new Gremlin -java8.bat, and that will work for you to launch the console. And now I'll hand it back to Cole to talk about some GLV runtime updates.
All right, thanks, Ken. So yeah, this piece, something I believe we covered a little bit in the previous contributor cast, but there's been a change in the policy in TinkerPop for when we will update the runtimes for different GLVs. The original structure there was that we would only, for the entire lifespan of a major TinkerPop release, so let's just say all of the 3.6 releases, we would be bound to a single major version of the runtime. The problem we ran into there was that some of their runtimes were going past their end of life date. Namely, it's just Node 10 was being used in 3.5, and that has been out of support for a little while now. So we've amended that policy where now if the runtime goes out of support, we'll have to bump it to the next LTS runtime, and just to make sure that we're always running on kind of actively supported runtimes. So these are all the versions that are changed here. All of the branches, Gremlin Go has been bumped to Go 120. Previously, we were building on Go 1.17. And then for Node, for Gremlin JavaScript, and for Gremlin, 3.5.7 is now on Node 16. 3.5.6 and earlier was on Node 10. So that was a big jump there. 3.6.5, 3.6 has always been on Node 16, so there's actually no change on that one. And 3.7, we've decided to launch on Node 18 here. And one thing to note, if you're following the Node release timelines here, Node 16 is approaching its end of life. If I remember correctly, it hits end of life in September this year. So there's a very good chance that the next release that comes up, all 3 branches will be aligned on Node 18. And then they should be pretty stable from there on. If we jump to the next slide here. Yeah, one other change I want to note here is that for the GraphSon serializers in Java, so just for the Java driver and Gremlin server, there's these new configuration options for max number length, max string length, and max nesting depth. These came as the result of an upgrade to Jackson DataBind to handle a security vulnerability, and it required that these configurations get set. So you can see the default values there, what we've settled on for TinkerPop. The idea with these defaults is that our hope is that the vast majority of users will never have to change these, never need to think about them. I think they should be sufficiently large, but if for some reason you've got very large numbers or something, they are configurable, so you can override them if you need to. One thing to note that's a little interesting is these are, especially for number length, it's a character limit, not a maxed value. So it's 10,000 characters in the serialized JSON for the number, which is a bit of a strange measure, but that is how that is measured here. And these can be configured on the server side. They can be set through the standard serializer config in your server config YAML. And in the driver, you can adjust it through the cluster builder and just through the driver settings there. So yeah, these are there. You should only need to change it as well for when you're reading the GraphSon. It doesn't apply for writing. So even if you do need to override these, I would suspect it's only in the driver that you really need to make the change. I think it's pretty unusual to be serializing such large numbers or strings when you're sending them to the server. So yeah, that's one change I want to highlight. And now I think I'll pass it back to Yang to wrap up the presentation here.
Yeah, thank you, Cole. Yeah, so that's it for a list of kind of the new features we wanted to highlight. Of course, like I said before, there's a bunch of changes that went into there, and especially there was a lot of bug fixes contributed from not just the committers, contributors, but also there's from the general community. So they're all in the changelog. If you're, feel free to check them out as you try these versions out. And we actually encourage people to try out our 3.7.0. It's got a bunch of new features. And probably, coming with the new features, there might be corner cases or bugs that we've missed. So, it'd be great if we can get feedbacks on them. So, yeah, and then any form of feedback is welcome. So if you see an issue, submit an issue. If you have some edits or code suggestions, you have your own fixes, throw up a PR, we'll take a look. And then also feel free to jump on the dev list or our Discord channel. They're all welcome. And, lastly, just many thanks, huge thanks to all of our contributors, our communities for all the awesome work. And then, yeah, we so hope to be able to bring more people onto the Contributor Cast as well. So, next time, feel free to reach out. And then we are going to end with a question slide. So yeah, so any more questions on all the contents we've talked about so far? Oh, okay. So why did there need to be a Tinker graph and a Tinker transaction graph? Couldn't Tinker graph just have a transaction feature? Okay, so I think that's for Valentin to answer then.
At some point, probably yes, but for performance reasons, it's different classes, at least for a while. Probably these graphs will also use different classes for elements, for some utilities like indexes. That's the reason.
Okay. Oh, a question from the audience for G. Would you say that the Gremlin updates are getting more frequent and larger these days? I think we're trying to I guess push out a more regular release cycle. I think one of the aims, as kind of we talk about updates, is that I think we want to set a regular release cycle, say aiming, for example, 4 releases a year, or set up like a regular expectations for the community. So then in that way, I think it will also help the community schedule their incorporation or upgrades, what they expect. If they are features they want to feedback, so that then they can plan to submit PRs earlier. I think just for example, this past code freeze, we got some very cool contributions from that wanted to. We had a Go translator contribution, but unfortunately, because of the code freeze and the amount of changes that needs to be put in, that didn't really make it to this release. So we kind of want to, I think, going forward, set up kind of a more expectation for the community to on some sort of, I guess, maybe not schedule, but like a more set way. And then also just a shout out to just monitor the dev list when we propose dates and timelines for these code freeze dates. But yeah, so I would say generally more frequent. We hope to make it more like scheduled, so like just give people more notice beforehand. And larger depends on the features. So I think with the push for 3.7, I think it's one of the major releases. I think, yeah, we probably are aiming to push out some more major changes. Yeah, I don't know. You guys have any comments or opinions on it? I'm just speaking on a.
In terms of frequency, I mean, yeah, it's probably more frequent than it used to be, because like in the years past, it's probably only like maybe 2 releases a year. But as Yang said, I think we're going to try to aim for 4 this year instead. So yeah, I guess you could say compared to past years, it is going to be slightly more frequent. But I do think that Yang brings a good point, right? It's more of the idea that we want them to be sort of scheduled ahead of time, rather than just like, oh, here's a bunch of updates, let's just release sort of thing. So yeah, that's what I think about it.
Yeah. And I think we were also trying to keep the communication stream open. So if there's something, any opinions, just drop us notes on Discord, and then or on the dev list post. Yeah. Hopefully that didn't put out any misinformation out there. Thank you. Oh, we've got another question from Sorry Not a Player. Working on getting ArcadeDB with Gremlin 3.7. What's the biggest improvement in performance, in your opinion, from 3.6? Performance. I'm not sure. I'm not aware if there's any particular performance improvement that's not already in 3.6 that's coming into 3.7. I think the majority of the 3.7, the focus was on the new features, but I could be missing things. So I guess I don't know if the you guys here have some more comments. And yeah.
In some cases, users can get performance improvement from properties on elements, because before 3.7 you need to send 2 requests, and it's definitely slower than 1 in 3.7 in case you need properties.
Yeah, so I think these are kind of like a byproduct. Can't find a specific word, but basically just as a result of these new features. But if there's anything I missed, we will probably also answer your question on Discord, just as a note. Yeah.
One other thing to add with that, I guess, is that I believe performance in general can be better in using Gremlin language script engine, the Antler-based grammar versus Gremlin Groovy. So as like stuff like that string concat function and other functions come in that reduce the need for closures on Gremlin Groovy, there may be performance benefits that can be gained there.
Yep. Another question. You mentioned that Tinker transaction graph is not for production cases. What is the use cases for it then?
I think now it's mostly for testing, for learning, education. Probably at some point it will be ready for production. I hope.
I think
as mentioned in the reference or upgrade docs, it does fully support the sort of TinkerPop transaction API. So it does allow you to play around with it. I think it can be very useful for you if you're thinking about using transactions with TinkerPop and you wanted a sort of a solution that came with like the official TinkerPop packages. It's a good way for you to sort of test and play around with that API.
Yeah, and also I think just if there's any test, if there as you guys are testing out 3.7 and then trying these out, feel free to also give us feedbacks. So it maybe you're like, oh, I don't like the way slowing things down or however it works. So we welcome feedbacks just to point that out. But yeah, any other questions? I think if not, I guess we will close. So yeah, thank you again for all joining us today. Oh wait, do we have any? Oh, one more question from Nathimbo. Not sure if this is the right place. Started playing with TinkerPop and Gremlin Python this week. Seems Gremlin Python may be missing explain traversal step implementation.
If it is, that's the first I've heard of it. If it is missing, that's definitely something we'll look at and try and get corrected. Perhaps it's something that we can take into Discord afterwards here, and
definitely.
If it's there and it works, we can give some guidance in Discord, and then if it needs to be improved in the next release, then we can talk about it there as well.
Definitely. So yeah. So yeah, no problem. And other questions? Okay, cool. And then with that, then thank you everyone. We will see you next time.